First speaker today is Professor Christopher Chapple. He's the Naveen and Pratima Doshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology at Loyola Marymount University here in Los Angeles. Dr. Chapple received his undergraduate degree in comparative literature and religious studies from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and his doctorate in the history of religions through the theology department at Fordham University. He served as the Assistant Director of the Institute for Advanced Studies of World Religions, and he's taught Sanskrit, Hinduism, Jainism and Buddhism for 5 years at the State University of New York at Stony Brook before joining LMU. His Dr. Chapple's research interests have focused on the Renounced traditions of India, so yoga, Jainism and Buddhism, and he's published quite a lot of books, including Karma and Creativity, a co-translation of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Non-Violence to Animals, Earth and Self in Asian Religions, another book, Hinduism and Ecology, co-edited with Mary Evelyn Tucker, and Jainism and Ecology. Okay, I will now hand you over to Professor Chapple, whose talk is titled Many Yogas, Modern Yoga, Vivekananda's Blueprint for Complementarity in relation to the paradigm shift in the understanding of physical laws.
I want to thank you all, and particularly thank the members of the DCF, the Dharma Civilizations Foundation, and Rita Sharma for putting all of these people, wonderful people, together in the same room. And I also want to applaud our physical environment here because it is really quite comfortable, but also urge you from time to time to gaze out of the window to your right, because nature really is here somewhere. Okay, this presentation will explore the emergence in the early 20th century of Swami Vivekananda's articulation of how the many yogas of jnana, karma, bhakti, raja provide a paradigm for coping with multiple approaches to spirituality. And it will be mentioned in the context of the zeitgeist of the late 19th century, early 20th century, which saw a shift from classical physics, which emphasized immutable laws and proclaimed or agreed to the biblical assertion that the world is 5,000 years old, a shift from that worldview to the worldview of modern physics, which heralds uncertainty, and that proclaims that, no, the world is 13.7 billion years old. And we're going to look at two ways in which this shift is now our current zeitgeist. Namely, we're going to look at how Swami Vivekananda influenced William James, who in turn influenced Whitehead philosophically, and that this movement has led to the acceptance of a new emerging field that we now call big history, or the epic of evolution, or the new story. And we're also going to look at very concrete sociological phenomena of the latter 20th century and early 21st century of the actual direct practice of yoga. So I'm quite ambitious in what I hope to do here, and I'll talk rather quickly, but hope you're able to follow along with this. Now, in those wonderful books that I mentioned earlier, he combines the insights of the Yoga Sutra with those of the Bhagavad Gita. And having done 25 years ago a very close study, was he really an Advaita Vedantin? No. As Gerald Larson has already reminded us, what he really did study was the Yoga Sutra and Sankhya. Now, the Yoga Sutra provides methods to bring oneself to greater clarity and freedom, technologies that involve ascending stages of meditation and discernment, as well as applied ethics, reflection on dreams, control of breath, etc. In each section of the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali elusively describes the goal of freedom with yet another set of terms: Nirbija Samadhi, Vivekakyati, Atmadarshana, Viveka Jnanam, Sattva Shuddhi, Dharma-mega Samadhi, Kaivalyam, so many ways to think about this culmination of the process of yoga. The Bhagavad Gita places these lofty ideals onto the battlefield of life. And Arjuna, as you recall, keeps on looking for the one definitive answer, and Krishna keeps on giving him all these different answers, always bringing it back to, within the narrative of a war epic, the reality of yoga changing depending upon context. And in this text, Vivekananda, in his text, the compilation of these wonderful works, he insightfully echoes Krishna's message to Arjuna. In some circumstances, one must act without concern for the results. In other situations, one must simply surrender in devotion. In other circumstances, the mind can be a tool to disassemble the sources of suffering through the remembrance of neti neti. It's not this, it's not that. Now, this methodology, if we reflect on it, represents an open tent approach to life, an inclusive philosophy, an attitude that says both and rather than my way or the highway. Okay? So when we hear Krishna saying, "You must follow me," it has a different flavor than what we see in similar parallel biblical assertions. Now, Western scholars, some of you have already heard these names recently, Max Muller, W. Norman Brown, Antonio de Nicolas, have seen Vedic roots in this open tent approach. Muller refers to the Rig Veda as outlining a paradigm that he refers to as henotheism. One god or goddess at a time as needed, and then you can move on to someone else. If you need money, go to Lakshmi. If you want to be a good academic, go to Saraswati. If you need to be assertive, go to Durga. And things will take care of themselves, but it's through our attention that our worlds become formed. Lokasangraha, as we heard yesterday beautifully in the evening from Rukmini. Now, W. Norman Brown detects a remarkable flow within what he puts together as a creation story from the Rig Veda. This flow moves from chaos, from asat, uncertainty, typified by the dragon Vritra, that is then overcome by the heroic Indra and his thunderbolt, establishing order, Sat, with the return of the monsoon, allowing the god of goodness and wealth, Varuna, to shore up society, and for people to find meaning in the midst of their activities. And in this, we find echo from the Vedas in the Yoga Sutra, a state called Ritam Bhara. The fact that we're able to embrace the flow for a moment before the chaos returns. We're able to dwell in that moment within rhythm, Rita, order, Rita, and artistry, Rita. Okay, here are those cognate words. And de Nicolas, in his work, works with these concepts in terms of seeing parallels in the paradigm shift from classical physics to modern physics, particularly inviting in the unpredictability aspect of the Vedic world and seeing resonance with what we see in Niels Bohr, what we see in Heisenberg. Okay, at that same moment that Vivekananda was laying the foundation for this shift in awareness, theorists on physics began to explore how numbers reflect the structures of the cosmos, with Heisenberg advancing the uncertainty principle in 1925, stating that the old scientific model of describing stimulus and response was inadequate, and that for every context, every scientific experiment will lead a specific result depending upon how the experiment is set up. Complementarity of wave and particle function at the level of subatomic physics demonstrates that certainty depends upon context. Einstein famously, through the rest of the century, developed his theory of relativity, and I just want to lift up Philip Glass, and one of his good friends is here. And if any of you saw Einstein on the beach this past weekend, you had a real treat of how musically and graphically and through really interval, tone, movement, he demonstrated the shift from the two-axis analysis of the world to multiple axes to represent the nature of the world mathematically, to spirals and circles, and a real feel of constant return accompanied by an expansion of consciousness that culminates in a final aria that just plain lifts up, as did Katsumita a few minutes ago, plain lifts up love as the foundation for everything that we experience. Now, William James attended Swamiji's lectures and met with him, spoke with him, and his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, really sort of bedrock for people within the discipline of religious studies. His book, Varieties of Religious Experience, presented as the Gifford Lectures in 1902, actually quotes Swami Vivekananda, and it inspired a worldwide interest in practical psychology of spiritual experience. Some 25 years later, in 1927, 1928, Alfred North Whitehead presented the Gifford Lectures again. He stated, right in the preface to them, that it was his intent to make William James's descriptions of mysticism more philosophical. So do you see a Guru Parampara here? Okay, Swami Vivekananda, William James, Alfred Whitehead. The result, the book Process and Reality, published in 1929, brings the insights shared by Swami Vivekananda to new levels, creating a language that has influenced generations of thinkers. And I'll highlight just a few, I have several, but Whitehead writes, the subject is the autonomous master of its own concrescence into subject-superject. Each creative act is the universe incarnating itself as one, and there is nothing above it by way of final condition. He seeks to move beyond a philosophy of discrete units toward an understanding of the organism, which he describes as the self-creative unity of the universe. He calls for a shift from naive materialism to an organic view that takes into account interconnectivity and interrelationality. He writes that change from materialism to organic realism is the displacement of the notion of static stuff by the notion of fluent energy. He quotes Heraclitus, all things flow, and those of us who have studied the pre-Socratics know the relationship and the mindset between the Upanishads and the pre-Socratics. He notes that each individual actual entity, these are his words, contributes to the datum from which its successors arise and to which they must conform. He calls these activities prehensions. And his notion of prehensions, or concrescent imaginations, or the unity of feeling, find parallel with the idea of samskara and vasana in Indian thought. Each human action, karma, leaves a residue that carries over into future experience. In some instances, these karmas are fraught with difficulty, categorized by Patanjali as afflicted or klesha or klishta. In other instances, through the process of ethical purification, one is able to create positive imprints that pave the way toward purified action and lead to purified, unmediated experience, a state known as Dharma-mega samadhi in yoga, and perhaps a state known as concrescence in Whitehead. The following quote captures the one in many and many as path to one philosophy that has enraptured Whiteheadians for nearly a century. Quote, the creative action is the universe, always becoming one in a particular unity of self-experience, and thereby adding to the multiplicity which is the universe as many. This insistent concrescence into unity is the outcome of one particular self-identity of each entity. And we can hear echoes a little bit of Vijnana Bhikshu with one and the many, and this is the topic of Professor Nicholson's wonderful book, Unifying Hinduism. And we could say that perhaps unwittingly, Whitehead was in dialogue with the very same Upanishads that informed Vijnana Bhikshu, and certainly with the Yoga Sutra, which informed Swami Vivekananda. Now, on the one hand, Whitehead privileges human individual experience as the only vehicle to understanding anything. On the other hand, he suggests that this experience of self-understanding can lead to a communion with the entire universe. He writes, "The oneness of the universe and the oneness of each element in the universe, those two things repeat themselves to the crack of dawn in the creative advance from creature to creature, each creature including itself in the whole of history, exemplifying the self-identity in things and their mutual diversities. The universe is always new." Now, this led to the work of one of my favorite Christian theologians, Sally McHugh, who wrote a book called Models of God, that says we don't have to think of God merely in terms of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Bible is full of rich metaphors for God. And she says, I'd rather think about God as mother, lover, and friend. Now, Thomas Berry, one of my professors at Fordham, was a great scholar of the Yoga Sutra, as well as Sri Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda. And he writes in describing that yogic experience, he says, the mind not only knows, it attains a dominance over reality. No longer subject to the external world, as in the period when the senses dominated the mind controls the sense functions and knows in a manner beyond the senses. The world is no longer opaque. It comes together in an ordered cosmos. The dispersed elements of reality lose the non-intelligibility associated with their existence in temporal succession. The point of meditation enables the light of the self to permeate the universe. The point on which the mind is fixed becomes simultaneously center and circumference of reality. And hence, I invite you to look out the window from time to time. Okay? What all of this led to, and throw in a little bit of Teilhard de Chardin, is really an expanded notion of our place within the universe. And as we know from the story of the first great flaring forth, that all things are moving away from all other things, millions and millions of galaxies within this universe. And yet, because all of us come from that same central originary point, before the differentiation into all of these aspects of matter, that all of us simultaneously are truly, physically, at the center of the universe. So when studying big history, we feel our smallness, and we feel that we are, in fact, the universe becoming conscious of itself. And without his read of the Yoga Sutra, I'm not sure that Thomas Berry would have put these things together quite in that way. Intimacy is at the core of this experience. Now, switching gears, another way, a very concrete way in which Vivekananda set the stage for us today, is with the dissemination of yoga. It began in the 19th century in North America, and here I'm channeling Phil Goldberg, okay, as well as Swami Vajraprana. And First, the transcendentalists, and then the theosophists came to our shores. And then we have the well-documented success of the Vedanta Society, established by members of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda mission, as well as the Self-Realization Fellowship of Paramahansa Yogananda. And Lisa Lehman, with us here, will soon release a film about the life of Yogananda. And the earlier film that we saw at the June conference on Swami Vivekananda from the 1960s, it's great, but it also could be remade. And, but there's beautiful archival footage from the early part of the 20th century. Unfortunately, we only have a few glimpses of Yogananda, no glimpses that I'm aware of Swami Vivekananda, who's gazing on everything that we're doing here. Okay? Now, but when these movements, the Vedanta, and here I don't mean this as a critique, it's an observation, but when these movements, and their Sitzenleben, were established, they had to appeal, because of the Asian Exclusion Acts of 1880 and 1920, they had to really appeal to the folks, the white folks here in America. So even today, if we go to the Vedanta Society, or if we go up to the Self-Realization Fellowship Shrine, we have to sit very properly in pews. And the buildings are like Protestant chapels, for the most part, and morning and afternoon pujas, okay, they're sort of like they're done, but that's not the focal point. So that we have even hymnals, and we have really the trappings of religiosity as observed in this country in the early 20th century, going all the way back to the 19th and 18th centuries. But in the 1960s, with a further revival in the 1990s, the model of lectures and Protestant-style worship began to change for two reasons. One, the countercultural movement of hippies saw all of these people streaming, Allen Ginsberg among the very first, streaming to Vrindavan, and people like Krishnadas coming back and doing India style. And then with 1965 and the change in immigration laws, that allowed my guru to come to New York City and eventually move to Long Island, and not a pew to be seen. Okay, we were on the floor hours every day. And then the culture shift continued. At Esalen, inspired by the work of Sri Aurobindo, we see the birth of transpersonal psychology. And then starting in the 60s and blossoming in the 90s, networks of yoga studios and meditation centers. Now, a little review. Theosophists established their international headquarters in Point Loma, California in 1900, opening the Raja Yoga School and College. And then Crotona was opened here in the Hollywood Hills in 1912 and moved to Ojai in 1926. And their esoteric society, I don't know if even the USC people know this, but the Esoteric Society of the Crotona Institute of the Theosophical Worldwide Network is now headed up by former USC professor Robert Elwood, who lives there. And Krishnamurti, of course, lived most of his adult life, at least partly, in Ojai. Now, the Vedanta Society was founded in New York City in 1894. The Ananda Ashram here in La Crescenta, founded in 1923 by the youngest of Swami Vivekananda's direct disciples, Swami Paramananda. And then in 1930, our good friends here from the Vedanta Society found their predecessors found our local Vedanta Society. Paramahansa Yogananda came in 1920, as mentioned earlier. Now, physical yoga entered big time on Sunset Boulevard not until 1967. Gunga White, who was still a teacher up in Santa Barbara, studied with Shivananda ashram people in Rishikesh. And then, of course, fast forwarding only 3 years, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada established his Los Angeles headquarters in 1970, having started in New York in 1966. Now, the 1990s, building on these really realities that had been sort of eclipsed during the materialism of the 1980s, 1990s, we saw three major new movements in the promulgation of yoga. One, the advent of the female guru. Okay, a lot of the guys that came in the 60s and were popular in the 70s, all of them are now dearly departed, but they were a little bit rascally a bit, so there was a little bit of bad press. And then what we find in the 1990s is the safety of Swami Chidvilasananda, known by her disciples as Guru Mayi, the compassion of Mother Meera, jointly based in Germany with frequent visits to the United States, as well as Amici. And one of my very first LMU students became her tour organizer in the 1980s. And Amici, of course, comes to LA with great acclaim every year. And this was really a change in the tone of how yoga could be conveyed. Meanwhile, the physical practice of yoga blossomed, and a forest, following the Shivananda school, established forest yoga in Santa Monica in 1982. The Iyengar Institute of Los Angeles was founded in 1984. Madhya Ezrati, Chuck Miller, and Alan Finger, who studied extensively with Pattabhi Jois, founded Yoga Works on Montana in 1987. And this was happening not only in LA, but primarily in LA. And now, some 15 years later, there are thousands of yoga studios throughout the United States. The Kirtan movement, rising from the city of Vrindavan, has been attempting to build a bridge between Hatha Yoga and Bhakti Yoga by holding these festivals, such as Bhakti Fest, and now the Indian community, which again, you go into the new, and there are hundreds of Hindu temples now in the United States since really the 1980s, nary a pew to be found, and for better or worse, rarely a sermon or a lecture. So on the one hand, we have lots of really good developments within the immigrant Hindu community, and still things to be learned from, say, the Vedanta Society, which has really consistently emphasized education as the way, the pathway toward personal transformation. So, conclusion. Swami Vivekananda set forth 4 models of yoga: karma, jnana, bhakti, and raja. All have now proliferated in numerous contemporary forms and cultural expressions. Traditional Indian bhakti can be found in Hindu temples nationwide, really worldwide, as well as in informal and formal kirtan groups. Jnana yoga is encouraged through study groups and formal courses of study. Raja yoga is practiced in countless studios. Karma yoga initiatives such as yoga off the mat, the ongoing work of the Ramakrishna Mission, and the work of, again, small organizations such as the Green Yoga Association, all of these groups seek to make real that project of social uplift that Swami Vivekananda and Gandhi advocated. Yoga ideas have influenced and helped shape modern America, indirectly through the open approach of process philosophy, which has come to really permeate the work of so many mainstream Protestant as well as Roman Catholic theologians, perhaps even really helped inspire Nostra Aetate and the acceptance of all religious truths officially by the Vatican. So that is perhaps a rather indirect success on the part of Swami Vivekananda. And then directly, he's been very successful with the wide acceptance of yoga in all of its various forms, now practiced out in the open by some 20 million Americans. So thank you, Swamiji.
Okay, so next up, we've got Professor Sthaneshwar Timalsina, who is Assistant Professor at the Department of Religious Studies in San Diego State University. He received a BA degree in Sanskrit literature with a major in Sanskrit grammar. That's quite impressive, at Mahendra Sanskrit University, and then traveled to Benares, India to do a master's in classical Indian philosophy, concentrating on yoga, tantra. Then got a PhD at Martin Luther University in Germany in classical Indian philosophy. His research interests include tantric traditions, literary theory, and ritual studies, and he's written over 20 peer-reviewed essays and articles, including an article for the Encyclopedia of Hinduism. His first book, Seeing in Appearance, was published in 2006, and then another book, Consciousness in Indian Philosophy, the Advaita Doctrine of Awareness Only, was published in 2008. And the talk today is going to be entitled Evolution and Moksha, Arguments Against Creationism and Determinism. I'll pass you over now.
Thank you so much for having me here. I had to change the title when the paper ended. I feel like, the given title and the real paper is having some kind of disconnection. So the new topic is Evolution and Moksha, Arguments Against Creationism and Determinism. Following the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created mankind in his own image. George Saunders proclaims, "The scariest thought in the world is that someday I'll wake up and realize I've been sleepwalking through my life." Like the character Bart Simpson and his good-for-nothing friends, the team Darwin enters the God's Eden and spoils the perfect show, forcing us to wake up. The conflict between religion and reason is not a new one. The new development is the theories of the origin of species and natural selection have made cosmological arguments a moot point. To make the story worse, the compromise between religion and science with the theory of evolutionary progress, as pioneered by Desjardins or Aurobindo, have hopelessly crashed with new information in the areas of genetics, and materialism has outlived Darwin himself. In consequence, the Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District Court case in 2005 has made obsolete to treat intelligent design as an alternate to the evolution theory. The statement of Abhinavagupta, the 11th century Kashmiri polymath, that Tarko Yogangam Uttamam, or the discursive thought, is the best part of yogic practice. The approach of Thomas Aquinas to combine reason and faith, or the approach of Vivekananda to apply the same measurements to justify religious claims as those applied in the field of sciences, to me, does not mean that we apply reason as long as it suits us and avoid the hard questions. If followed this type of reasoning, we will find Michelle Bachmann or Pat Robertson the most reasonable people. In the wake of rationality, a modern man, as Vivekananda puts it, in quote, whatever he may say in public, knows in the privacy of his heart that he can no more believe. Unfortunately, the Isle of God, defended by George Wright, George Price, Harry Rimmer, John Whitcomb, Henry Morris, or Philip Johnson, has hopelessly crashed. It seems at this point that the advocates of the intelligent design are not intelligent enough to understand the gravity of reasoning. And if not for Darwin, these guys have let the God down. One escape from this paradox is to adopt the approach of Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard poignantly puts in his Fear and Trembling, Abraham, in quote, left his earthly understanding behind and took faith with him, end quote. When he walked with his son Isaac to the top of Mount Moriah, the issue of faith becomes prominent as he argues, in quote, because faith begins precisely where thinking leaves off, end quote. I can question the belief that the earth is round and come to the conclusion with reasoning. However, how am I to prove or disprove that Moses had a nice little chat with God on Mount Sinai? When Arjuna warns Krishna, "You are confusing me by giving conflicting instructions." Or when the Buddha instructs his disciples, in quote, "Monks, adopt my words only after having them examined and not out of faith." They are miles apart from Kierkegaard. Vivekananda is unwavering when he proclaims that if a religion is destroyed by such investigations, it was then all the time useless, unworthy superstition, and the sooner it goes, the better. I am thoroughly convinced that its destruction would be the best thing that could happen, end quote. Both the stress of the Buddha on the correct view, samyak drishti, and the foundation of Hindu theology on the fervent desire to know, jigyasa, do not place faith at the core of the spiritual quest. Apparently, not all the prophets and not all the religions are enthused to adopt Kierkegaard. Vivekananda bluntly puts, religions that have held onto the idea of an extra-cosmic deity can no more stand on their feet. He saw that he could reconcile the foundational concept of the Brahman that did not require an extrinsic entity for creation with the evolutionary model. Brahman, in this depiction, is the most basic and most simple of the principles that combines both the organic and non-organic materials. Vivekananda reiterates on this ground that, in quote, "The self is the essence of this universe, and you are one with this universe." The question at this juncture is, can the theory that consciousness is the most basic principle behind creation replace both the intelligent design and physicalism? Reading Thomas Nagel's work, Mind and Cosmos, why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false, gives the impression that it is quite probable. To begin with, the primary claim of materialism that the immaterial consciousness accidentally emerges of matter is not founded on reason. Some accidents is not a logic. In Nagel's summation, the issues of consciousness, intentionality, meaning, purpose, thought, and value are the key issues that have not been properly answered by the existing materialism. Each of these topics deserves closer attention. Nagel argues, in quote, "If mind is a product of biological evolution, if organisms with mental life are not miraculous anomalies but an integral part of nature, then biology cannot be a purely physical science. Rather than making the mind a side effect, this leads to the centrality of mind and the failure of reductionism to explain the emergence of life suggests the same direction. Rather than considering the mind as something radically different from and non-existent in the basic fabric that gives rise to life, it is reasonable that the alloy that mutates and assumes the form of life is inherently endowed with such properties. If organisms are intrinsically mutating to different states, and in this sense not designed by an intelligent entity, they are free to the extent they can exercise their being. This freedom, in my understanding, is far greater than even the absolute freedom bestowed by an external entity, the core issue of free will in theism. The foremost issue concerning consciousness is the brain event identical to the mental event? If the mental events are physical events in the brain, our consciousness can be simply reduced to chemical effects, and biological entities will be simply complex algorithms. On the other hand, if we experiencing pain, our neurons producing certain chemicals or them producing particular electromagnetic waves during the state that we experience pain are two different entities, materialism has not been able to answer the key questions relating consciousness. If consciousness is a byproduct of a complex algorithm, it cannot be the most basic principle or the fabric of creation, as would the design itself is intelligent party would say. To make consciousness irreducible, Kripke adds an argument from the side of experience. Our experience of water, for instance, is not the water itself. The taste we have of the freshly brewed coffee is not the coffee, but it's just the effect of having a sensory contact with coffee. Tom Sorrell proposes a model of neutral monism to address the issue of consciousness, acknowledging these and various other problems in defining consciousness. The dualist, materialist, and idealist position all have failed to properly answer the fundamental problems. Following this model, certain physical states in the central nervous system are also the mental states. The same problems emerge if we try to analyze our cognitive capacity within the evolutionary framework. Our ability to use language, for instance, comes to this category. Interpersonal communication and cultural memory fall under the same category. When we perceive a tree, the identity we make of a tree is not through experience from the past, but simply through deduction. Nagel argues with this example that, in quote, any evolutionary account of the place of reason presupposes reason's validity and cannot confirm it without circularity. The conclusion is that, just like consciousness, reason cannot be explained by simply relying on physical evolution. Not only does materialism consider the emergence of consciousness an accidental byproduct, it has no explanation for the emergence of reason, for consciousness to function as an instrument of transcendence, and for the ability to grasp objective reality and objective value. There is no teleology purpose. There is no teleology in chemical mutation. The given reality, on the contrary, does not appear to be teleologically empty. Theological argument is not less pathetic either. If my purpose of being here is known only to God, God knows why I'm here, it is as good as not having any teleology. On the contrary, if creation is self-replication, not of lifeless chemicals, but of psychophysical entity endowed with its own purpose, evolution becomes teleologically possible. This answers the question why the biological selection does not explore all possible options before giving rise to this complex mechanism. Algorithms cannot have the origins of the species as their goal. And if we explore closely, evolution has occurred without exploring all other possible alternatives. This, however, is also true that evolution has explored numerous options. sufficing to reject an extrinsic omniscient creator. So evolution has accidents, not that intelligent design, but it has not explored every single possible algorithms, and therefore it does have teleology. Evolutionary biology has failed to explain our evaluative judgment. As Nagel says, in quote, realists do not believe that the evaluative element in such a judgment can be explained by anything else. Are these the truths grounded on themselves and not anything else? Following materialism, mental facts cannot be true on their own account. It is hard to fathom the mind-independent moral or evaluative truth, where value begins from our desires and inclinations and is built by experience, reflection, and culture. These are just a few arguments that pose an enigma to the neo-Darwinian materialism. However, the daylight is too mature to go back and sleep in the lap of the intelligent being. Robert Lanza and Bob Burnham's text, Biocentrism, How Life and Consciousness Are the Keys to Understanding the True Nature of the Universe, endeavors to explain the world by placing consciousness at the center. Some of the maxims in their work include: reality is a process that involves our consciousness, our internal and external perceptions are intertwined, and in isolation of consciousness, the universe can exist only in a possibility state. These premises led Lanza and Berman to conclude that the universe is fine-tuned for life, and this can be explained only through biocentrism. This approach is not that different from what Vivekananda had proclaimed: I am one with the universe. I am one with the air that surrounds me, one with heat, one with light, eternally one with the whole universal being. Genetic determinism maintains that genes, accompanied by environmental conditions, determine our embodiment and our behavior while experiencing ourselves as embodied subjects. Contemporary genetic theory suggests that organism can be simply reduced to physical principles based on the laws of physics and a genetic program. In a superficial level, determinism seems correct. If determinism were to fail, our market system would collapse, advertising companies would be bankrupt, supermodels would be jobless, Sarah Palin would say something meaningful, and the whole world, as we know it, would go haywire. Both religion and evolutionary biology have defended some form of determinism, and our behavior do not contradict these claims. Following strong theological determinism, the Creator God determines all events in history. Following this stream of thought, everything that happens has been predestined to happen by an omniscient, omnipotent divinity. Following the weak form of determinism, God's omniscience is perfect, and therefore what God knows about the future will inevitably happen, and therefore the future is already determined. Whether determined by God or by genes and environment felt in our drives, impulses, reflexes, emotions, and cognitive capabilities, biological behavior appears determined, and the scope of free will has thus remained only in philosophy books. Placing a self-replicating psychophysical entity at the center of evolution alters this paradigm altogether. One, there is no one determining our life events, and we are solely responsible for what happens in our lives and our surroundings. Two, we are not simply an automata, a complex machine, a cyborg, but have a higher place with our capabilities to create our own destiny. we have the capacity to liberate ourselves from the paradigm of determinism, and the concept of moksha rests on this assumption. Following the doctrine of karma, our activities lead to consequences, and we create a pattern of actions based on our samskaras or imprint and vasanas or the lingering effects. The concept of moksha or untying invokes the concept of pasha or the snare, that you are tied and you get out of that tie. Organisms follow their instincts, which in turn are based on raga or passion, dvesha or aversion, and moha or delusion. Raga and dvesha are grounded on pleasure and pain. Organisms have the tendency to enjoy pleasure and avoid suffering. We inherit instincts from earlier biological forms, and our zeal for survival and propagation are embedded in our genetic structure. Emotions such as fear or anger only display our genetic memory, as the instincts we develop in this life are woven with the ones borrowed from the infancy of evolution. Following the Buddha, our lust for food, good sensation and enjoyment give us the sense of continuity. Pashupatas add that even the sense of disgust, doubt, fear, shame, revulsion, and vanity are the snares that tie us in the karmic cycle. The quest for liberation has traditionally been accompanied with tapas, the practice of endurance for extreme conditions. And the subjects who are considered free are free of instincts and drives, including the instinct of survival. Exposing oneself to solitude in the forest or caves, being exposed to death by living in the cremation grounds, enduring excessive heat and cold, various degrees of food and water deprivation, all point to the same direction of overcoming basic instincts. Following the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, 55 through 72, the subject whose mind has been resolved, a sthita prajna, thoroughly cast off all cravings of mind, is not driven by temptation of external stimuli, and are free from ego and are not motivated by desire. This is also called the state of being identical to the Brahman. Vedantins describe liberation as the removal of ignorance and its effect, the constellation of karmas, doubt, error, and as a consequence, freedom from all the bondage. A Paramahamsa is described as someone who is not affected by cold, hot, pleasure, pain, respect, or insult. He is considered free of pride, egotism, desire, aversion, anger, greed, or similar afflicting properties. When Buddha achieved this state, he had no desire left. So in the Puranas, we have Shukadeva or Ashtavakra achieving this state. A Jivan Mukta is free from the vasana, perfumes that cling us to the world. As Yoga Vasishtha mentions, that one has to free from the drives, reflexes even, control what is biologically given. While acting in the world, he is not afflicted by actions. This state is repeatedly described by terms of freedom or swatantrya in the Trikasaiva literature. Actually, consciousness is depicted in this system as inherently autonomous, and it is with the pure will of consciousness that the world manifests in the network of consciousness. This is the power of autonomy inherent to the self, called Swatantra Shakti, as Abhinava describes, that gives manifestation of the phenomenal world. It is the mere will of this autonomous self that gives rise to the world, and the world returns back to this very cosmic principle, pure consciousness. If there is any free will, it is in this yogic state where no biological conditions or instincts or drives or reflexes control the subject's action. The actions of this liberated being are solely guided by the principle of compassion. To embrace this stream of argument, in Indian philosophical term, is to adopt the model of Satkarya. Professor Larson is here, who knows Satkarya a lot. Or that there is no categorical difference between the cause and the effect. If an evolutionary model is applied and intelligent design is negated, even the Nyaya arguments of external causation will fall apart. This is not about appropriating one model grounded in Indian culture and rejecting the beliefs of other cultures. This is about sacrificing beliefs for the sake of rationality. This is for the hope of the survival of humanity. As we sacrifice reasoning, we are not that different from other animals in the lower evolutionary strata. And liberation in this paradigm is our ability to free ourselves from all the deterministic tendencies and drives. And there is absolutely nothing mystical about it. Thank you so much.
Okay, so the next talk is by Professor Sangeetha Menon. She's a professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. She's professor and head of the Consciousness Studies program there at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. Her published work spans 18 years and highlights the nature of the complex experiences in the light of global humanistic values such as well-being and personal growth. Recent publications focus on a comparative study of emotions, the nature of agency and primacy of experience. Her latest publication in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology argues for altruism as a fundamental value that drives human actions. She's a distinguished member of the International Society for Science and Religion, and which has a lot of very distinguished members, including Nobel laureates. Dr. Menon has edited 4 books, Consciousness, Experience and Ways of Knowing, Perspectives from Science, Science and Beyond, Cosmology, Consciousness and Technology in Indian Religions, and Consciousness and Genetics. She's also a council member of the Indian Council for Philosophical Research in New Delhi. She's authored 1 book entitled Beyond Experience, Consciousness in the Gita, and actually her latest book is entitled Brain, Self and Consciousness, Explaining the Conspiracy of Experience, and that's 2013 Springer. And as well as all these publications, she's spoken at many universities in India and abroad, and also been a visiting professor at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies at Oxford University, as well as at Nanzan University in Japan. And the talk today is entitled Consciousness, Self-Transformation and Yoga-Dharma, introduced to Sangeetha Menon.
Namaste, good morning. First, many thanks to Dr. Rita Sharma and Dr. Manohar Shinde, and also to the University of Southern California and the Dharma Foundation for giving me an opportunity to be with you and share some of the ideas this noon. Friends, I think the previous speaker has raised some issues on consciousness. And at the beginning, let me say that I'm not going to say much about Swami Vivekananda because I've not read him as much as many of you have. But what I wish to do is to invoke the spirit in which Swami Vivekananda conceived of the idea of education, and to use his phrase, man-making education. The contemporary discussions on consciousness, if you're familiar with it, are primarily centered on the disciplines of neuropsychiatry and neurosciences. And the mainstream view is that consciousness is either a medical phenomenon or it is a physical entity. And most of the time, you can do away with it. Can Swami Vivekananda's vision for man-making education offer a critique to the mainstream scientific view? Perhaps yes, if there's an emphasis on humanistic values such as well-being, inclusivity, and self-transformation as guiding our lived experiences. The idea of man-making education of Swami Vivekananda essentially indicates the possibility of self-transformation and intrinsic changes of the person, which he believed would lead to social transformation as well. Friends, I would like to make a statement here, because since we don't have much time to go into the arguments behind it, that today, most of us who work in consciousness studies, in the area of consciousness studies, whichever the discipline be, consider that the brain and the self are the final frontiers of consciousness. So let me repeat it, the brain and the self. And it is the boundaries of the brain and the self that we have to continuously contest and expand. A person-centered approach to consciousness will help place neuropsychological ideas such as proprioception and brain mapping in the context of human self, guided by the possibility to include more, to be more, to reconnect with the lives around, and most importantly, to be ontologically grounded. Essentially, the argument that I wish to share is that consciousness is the beholder of not just neural mechanisms, but also the myriad rich experiences that you and I have, and also the self, who is the beholder of both. Let me give a glimpse of the major challenges in consciousness studies, which I would like to believe is three. First is, some of you would be familiar with, is the binding problem or the heart problem, about which was published in Scientific American. Again, the famous author, I don't have to share his name, but Chalmers, you would know, that how discrete neurochemical, quantitative neurochemical processes give rise to something which is unitary, qualitative, and subjective. So how is that which is discrete, quantitative, which is neurophysical, give rise to something which is qualitative, unitary, subjective experience, which is you and me? How does the brain and the self engage in not only in a feedback mechanisms, but also feed-forward mechanisms? How do they influence each other? Often we learn about how the brain influences the self and how you and me would be in a certain physical or medical condition. But have you also thought about how the self influences the brain? How the self can be taught to influence the brain? What is the relation between lifestyle changes, changes in self-perceptions and attitudes, and ontological commitment, which bring about self-transformation, and, most importantly, neural and motor progress, particularly in the case of paraplegic and quadriplegic patients? If you are curious to read more about what I just mentioned, please read Jonathan Cole. Maybe some of you are already familiar with his name and his works, beautiful works he has written about his conversations with quadriplegic and paraplegic people. Jonathan Cole. Today's mainstream discussion in consciousness studies has brought in the role of the self in an emphatic manner. And let's remember that it is not always to affirm, but most often to dismiss the self. And either dismissing or affirming self is considered to be significant to understand the workings of the brain. And this is evidenced by the increasing number of books which is being published in the scientific domain as well as the domains of psychology and philosophy, bringing in the relation of the self or the concept, idea of self itself as a major puzzle in consciousness studies. A central question that runs through the major discussions today in disciplines such as neuropsychiatry, phenomenology, and philosophy is the place, nature, and origin of the self. Self is mostly accepted as an organizing structure, embellishing the lives of an otherwise information processing system with colors, meanings, and motivations. Such a tenor also brings together disciplines as disparate as anthropology, cognitive science, philosophy, and biology. In the recent times, the debates on self have more or less moved away from studying an abstract object to a living subject whose personhood is challenged and framed by neural and mental disposition. Disorders that alter self-perceptions indicate how delicate and thin the neural and mental divide between what we call as normalcy and lunacy is. The challenge is, friends, not one way, but two ways. We know that the subjective self through experiences, values, attitudes, and self-perceptions can alter or influence neural challenges to bring in qualitative progress in life. The central question now is the self a subject for science? Would science seriously consider self as a subject? In both senses, literally and figuratively, the response would be no. Self is an object for science, since as a subject, it's a non-entity for a scientific discussion. And again, if you are more interested in perhaps a bit of a sarcasm which I'm trying to bring here, read Astonishing Hypothesis and see how it begins and ends. Are we right in perceiving subjectivity and self as objects to be studied in test subjects alone in the lab? Traditionally, the self has been included in the domain of religion and philosophy. The interest in science for the self in recent times is in the context of consciousness studies with reference to two phenomena. Again, without going into the details of it, these are ownership and agency of the person in and through one's experiences. These are the two ideas which are discussed in papers in cognitive sciences. You read Sean Gallagher, others, you would see these two ideas coming again and again, ownership and agency, which I think also very much central in any approach to Eastern traditions, let alone Indian philosophy. In our daily life, taking a phenomenological approach to the self, we look for the various dimensions and realms that indicate to us the presence of the self, in spite of the difficulties in talking about the self and establishing it with a sound theory. The individual unique stories of ourselves are designed by the values and beliefs we cherish, attitudes and perceptions we covertly possess, and memories that run through our thoughts and influence our judgment all the time. With a complex set of personal and interpersonal entities harbored in ourselves, in the course of a day, we feel secure at times, insecure at other times, and we constantly search for our notion of well-being. The day's activities, we believe, have the purpose of leading us to a being well state, or in biological terms, to a steady flow of dopamine in our bloodstream. The central motivation for understanding the brain, the self, and through these two consciousness is to rediscover human well-being, especially for a person who is challenged by mental conflicts and other dissipative disorders. Along with other disciplines, psychology too is shifting its focus of study from a pathological orientation to a positive orientation of life. What the study of pathological states finally seeks is the rediscovery of the states of happiness and positive adaptation. A fundamental factor necessary in tracing the boundary of the self is the sense of security we live with. The sense of security is constituted by, if I may say this, the fears that decide our biases in responding to situations and the nature of our desires and its goal. At this point, to wake you up and to wake myself, let me share a story from the Mahabharata, the Yaksha Prasna. You would know that at some point, the Pandava brothers were living in the Dvaitavana, the forest, and they're depressed, and one beautiful day, but of course they didn't feel it as beautiful because they were fatigued by thirst and hunger, and they were sitting down under the shade of a huge tree. Tree is always important. They were very unhappy, and all the brothers except Yudhishthira started lamenting about the fate and the unending number of woes that followed them. Yudhishthira smiled, at least he could smile, and said, "This is not the time to look back and think of the might-have-beens. Our immediate worry is this: how are we to quench this dreadful thirst that has been troubling us since some time? What a scarcity." The story goes that Yudhishthira sends his brothers one by one, and the brothers don't return. And the number of brothers are exhausted. No more brothers are left to go in search for water. And finally, as the leader, he gets up and goes in search of his brothers as well as in search of few drops of water. Apparently, what has happened is the brothers finds a lake, and like in many of the stories, the lake is guarded by an yaksha, and the yaksha is a very proud person, very possessive of his lake, and he wants the brothers to play a game with him, which is to answer a list of questions which are also equally interesting, which are listed in Yaksha Prashna. The brothers were impatient, and they equally thought proud of their belongings, were reluctant to respond to the yaksha, and finally had to die, or had to become unconscious or whatever, and they couldn't get water as well. So the story is that the Yudhishthira goes there. He also is thirsty, but then he is inquisitive, curious, but also patient. He confronts the yaksha, and he thought he should win this game, perhaps by responding to the yaksha as well as getting some drops of water. So he answers all the 60-odd questions of yaksha, and to yaksha's happiness, he is not only granted water from the lake, but also the lives of the four brothers. Friends, let us think a little bit more about this particular story and the extremely intricate mental dispositions of the people involved in this story. Yudhishthira and his brothers had to face two risks. One, the risk of having to die with no water to drink, and two, the risk of having to die by giving wrong or no answers to yaksha. At any case, there was the risk of death in both options of choices and decisions. The brothers were already fatigued by hunger and also by their depressed minds. Their immediate worry being thirst, Yudhishthira had almost forced them to find a water source. Nagula and other brothers find a lake and confront the owner of the lake. With the desire for a few drops of water, the surroundings did not matter much to them. They were unable to see and listen to the happenings of the immediate environment. At the same time, the water of the lake was found so cool and inviting that even death was disinteresting and was not a concern. What was pulling them deeply was a haste to somehow taste a few drops of water. Hence, they either did not hear the voice of yaksha, perhaps he called them in a very slow, silent voice, or ignored him who forewarned them of death. At that point, quenching thirst was the primary desire. Even the sights of the dead bodies of the brothers did not thwart the motivation of Bhima, Arjuna, and Sahadeva from stepping to the lake and drinking water. Only Yudhishthira hears the voice of yaksha in spite of the desire to quench the thirst, and has the patience as well as the courage to respond to yaksha's questions. So can we stop engaging in desiring and in acting out our desires? Can we objectify the subliminal forces that shape our choices? All these so as to gain a stable sense of security? Not really. The only way to know the limits of our sense of security is to reset the limits every time we test them. Just as we have a sense of our physical body and a sense of ourself, the sense of security that is deeply ingrained is fundamental to our physical and psychological equilibrium. Desires produce intentions, and intentions leads to actions. Desire refers to having an urge for something, the need to possess or dispossess, the intention to achieve. On the one hand, cognitive elements constitute desires, but on the other, desires are imbued with emotions, values, and our worldviews. What causes a desire? What is achieved through the fulfillment or non-fulfillment of the desire? How does desire and its ultimate purpose of well-being or common good influence our biases in perceiving purpose? Well, the question is, are human actions in general free of fundamental act of desiring? Can we be free of desires? We wish to control outcomes, but do we have control on the multiple factors that decide the outcomes? In fact, we could say that no action can be performed without the motivation that springs from desire. No amount of consequential thinking and conceptual tools will give us an exhaustive scale of outcomes. And no action is free from some amount of expectation. All actions are founded in desire, anticipation of outcomes, and some degree of anxiety. These three subliminal psychological forces together determine our sense of security. And this is exactly the philosophy which is presented when we are exposed to the state of Arjuna in the battlefield, when his state of mind cannot be described in any clear terms. He definitely had concern about the people who was around him, did not want to engage in a battlefield that would perhaps make him a loser in life. And it is perhaps the very reason that Arjuna's predicament in life is perhaps the predicament of many of our lives, of the difficulty in choice making, because the options are equally favorable or equally not so favorable. And it is in such a context that the idea, or the most complex and perhaps the most powerful idea of yoga, is presented by Bhagavan, Lord Krishna, in the Gita. And the essential definitions of yoga being, one is to primarily focus on your action, because you have already made a choice to engage in an action. So be responsible and engage in an action. That is karmasu kaushalam. And another definition of yoga of having equanimity of perception when you are presented to a difficult situation. And the third is to be in a state of peace and calm in spite of the sound and noise around. And fourth is to disunite yourself from being unhappy or being of a constricted person, of a constricted mind, to include more dukkha samyoga viyogam. Well, I wish I had more time to discuss about the Gita ideas of yoga, because these are some of the favorite ideas I cherish and influenced in my writing. But what I wish to share with you is that the sense of security that we discussed a few minutes before is the sense we have of displacement or its absence, of losing or not, and being in control or not being in control. And as individuals and unique individuals, with our makings determined by a host of private factors which are psychological and cultural, we perceive danger and displacement determined by our sense of security. An optimal sense of security is decided by the nature of choices and decision-making, and also our tolerance to outcomes. How many minutes do I have? Okay, so I asked you the question right at time.
Yeah.
So concluding is always a difficult task, because you have to say all the important ideas towards the last. So, but let me try to share perhaps some of the key points which I would like to leave with you. Biology and philosophy are the two disciplines that raise fundamental yet provoking questions about human life. In the recent times, the central question that these disciplines ask are centered on the notion and experience of the self of the person. Brain and the self are the two phenomena that today everyone, from the common person to the scholar, is looking at to unravel the puzzle of consciousness. The belief is that somehow consciousness is connected with the self of the person. It is our experience that brings us the joys and woes of consciousness present to our waking, dreaming, and deep sleep states. It's also our dear self that is prone to the delicate functioning of the brain that directs the conscious states that you and I experience, and also the possibility of going into unconscious states due to neural dysfunctions. In all these, the center point is the experience along with the experiencer, which I would like to underline. It is the most intimate beholder of the experience, the experiencer that responds to the states of being conscious and perhaps also the state of the unconsciousness. While an important correlate of consciousness that all disciplines and all people are interested in is awareness and different degrees of it, there are other aspects that connect consciousness and the self in finer ways. And these are some of the ideas which I shared with you a while ago. And why I wanted to bring in ideas like desire and sense of security is that many of the philosophical discussions in consciousness is getting back to the same danger of discussing something which is so abstract and hence very much unrelated to our daily lives. But I want to bring in, again, to the attention of the audience that consciousness is a subject which is very alive, which is very much alive in every moment of our lives. So it's equally important that while we discuss consciousness, we not only bring in perhaps a conceptual framework which is abstract, perhaps which is strong and powerful, but it's also important to bring in the experiential realm from our lives, because finally we are dealing with not an abstract object, but very much enriched subject. Whatever theories of cognitive mechanisms we develop to explain the finer tastes and dispositions of humans, these very graces stay in hiding when their causes and origins are explored. There's a cognitive closure that is confronted, particularly when we discuss complex potentialities of the human self, such as common good and altruism. The character of the person, his or her ability to exercise choice, free will, and to take responsibility of acts and their consequences, take us to the realm of well-being and how it is connected to the being of the person. Fundamental values that humans cherish, such as truth, love, and beauty, are tied up with the deeper realms of our core self, which are not amenable to reductionist filtering. I would think that it is an engaged and person-centric experiential approach to science that Swami Vivekananda would have dreamed, and had he been sitting in this audience. He would have dreamed such a vision of education that leads to the making of the person. Vivekananda's scheme of education brings to light its constructive, practical, and comprehensive character. And such an approach is particularly relevant in the context of consciousness studies in contemporary discussions. Thank you so much.
The next speaker is Swami Atmavidyananda, who is a Swami of the Ramakrishna Order of India, and he's at the Vedanta Society at US, and affiliated with USC and at the Vedanta Society in LA. He's also the religious director for the USC Hindu Students Organization, and also the Academy for Vedantic Studies at USC. He's the treasurer currently of the Vedanta Society of Southern California, and in addition to these activities, he's the organist, choir director, composer, and a lecturer. So a lot of other things there, very musical as well. He graduated from Occidental College in 1971 with a major in mathematics and a minor in chemistry, and received an MA degree from Stanford University in 1972. His hobbies include music, hybridizing, and astronomy, and he's also composed numerous choral works and some instrumental works. His major works, musical works that is, include one operetta and one opera with interfaith themes, a symphony using the melodies from Ram Bhajans, and two oratorios using the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda as the source text for the lyrics. So it's very interesting. So I'll hand you over to Swami Atmavidyananda, and the title of his talk today is Vedantic Paradigms in Relation to Scientific Inquiry.
So thank you for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to share these ideas. And my perspective will be somewhat different from most of our fine speakers. Having a modest background in math and science and then becoming a monastic, it was important for me that my view of the physical world, my model as to how the physical world was constructed, matched my spiritual view as to how the physical world came into being. Swami Vivekananda stressed that truth is truth and that science and religion shouldn't contradict each other. Now, human beings have tried over the ages to make science and religion agree, but it's been kind of a rocky road. And I won't go into a lot of details, but probably one of the prime examples would be the one where early in our history they observed the heavenly bodies and they felt that the circle was the most perfect geometric shape, so all heavenly bodies had to go in circles. And then as they observed it more carefully, they saw that was not a very good approximation, so they had to make circles on top of circles, and then it was circles on top of circles on top of circles. And eventually they just had to throw the model out and find that the things weren't going around the Earth, they were going around the sun, and they were going in ellipses. So it's that kind of progress in science that we find our models going through. Our models have to be updated as our information gets better and better. And then there are times when our scientific views interfere with our spiritual faith. As it's been mentioned earlier, Newton's laws were very successful in explaining things, and it created this deterministic clockwork-like universe. And some people thought, oh, well, God can retire if there was a God, but and maybe there isn't even a God. We can just have a universe that's somehow wound up and it just goes on merrily on its own way. So I think there's going to be a huge paradigm shift coming up soon. There was one right after, as a previous speaker mentioned, right after Swami Vivekananda passed away, the paradigm shifts of going from the deterministic Newtonian world to the world of quantum mechanics and relativity. And these involved huge paradigm shifts. Newton's laws had been very successful in explaining a lot of things. Maxwell's equations described electricity and magnetism very well, but they didn't square with each other. And when it came to the nature of light, the predictions were completely off. And the nature of light was quite paradoxical. And so they had to come up with a different model of the universe. Einstein had to throw out the seemingly obvious assumption that space and time are absolutes in order to come up with this theory of relativity. And Einstein, Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and others had to take a whole new approach to modeling the physical nature of subatomic particles from a deterministic model to a probabilistic quantum mechanical model. Now, the two areas that I think we need a paradigm shift in now are the realm of cosmology, the Big Bang model, and our understanding of consciousness, which has already been addressed to some extent by our previous two speakers. Is there any hope, given the bad history, that religion and science can actually help each other here? That perhaps there's a religious paradigm that will bring some sense to our scientific inquiry. Now, of course, scientific theories have been successful in so many ways that many scientists do take a materialistic approach to life. They think, well, religion's just pre-scientific superstitions, and they all claim to be true, and they all say something different. But you see from the tradition of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, they say, no, they're not so different after all. The experiential is the same, and the fundamental nature of these religious traditions are the same. And people like Joseph Campbell have pointed out, if you can read the symbolism of these faiths, they really are saying very much the same thing. So it's in that spirit that I search for a model, and I'm greatly indebted to, of course, all of the Swamis of the Ramakrishna order, Swami Vivekananda and Ramakrishna, and John Dobson and Amit Goswami. Those are the people that have primarily contributed to my particular model of the universe. So let's just look at some of the problems. Currently, the cosmologists are working with this, the Big Bang model. But they're working with this model not as a model to be tested, but as a model that is assumed to be correct. Their experiments are designed assuming that it's correct. When they get data, they assume that it's correct, and they force the data into the model. And if they have to make something up to make the data fit, they do. Rather than saying, for example, that if the Big model is correct, Big Bang model is correct, then we must postulate the existence of dark matter and dark energy. They say the Big Bang model proves that dark matter and dark energy must exist. I think that's intellectually dishonest. Neuroscientists, as has been pointed out, if you're coming from this idea of monistic materialism and trying to get consciousness as an epiphenomenon of matter, they point to the fact that they're able to come up with many correlates between brain states and consciousness, but the field is fraught with all sorts of difficulties, and it would take a 1,000-page book to review all of the data that shows that there are many problems with this model. You can't explain all sorts of phenomena, like the experiences of people having near-death experiences, past life remembering, multiple personality disorders. All sorts of things simply can't be explained by that kind of model. So today I will present a Vedantic paradigm of the universe that I believe can make better sense out of quantum mechanics and relativity theory, and possibly provide a cosmological model that will avoid some of the problems of the Big Bang model, and give us a new foundation to study the field of consciousness. Sound like a politician. I'm promising everything here, aren't I? Swami Vivekananda stressed that all knowledge should lead to unity, and the explanations about things in nature should come from within those things themselves. And the model I'm presenting will fulfill both those criterions. Now, both relativity theory and quantum mechanics, very interestingly, put the observer into the middle of the physics. And so I think that's a clue that consciousness has to be in there, and that perhaps Shankara's model that this is an apparitional universe, an apparent universe, a misperception of Brahman, might be a good place to start. So we'll start with this idea that Brahman is the infinite, undivided, unchanging reality with its power of Maya to manifest an apparent universe without actually changing Brahman. Now, while it's impossible to really put any of this into words, any model that we have is simply an approximation. I think we can best understand why Brahman manifests through its power of Maya by thinking that Brahman manifests to know itself, and this has been mentioned earlier. And you find this in the mythologies and religious traditions all over the world. This is one of those core ideas that you can see if you look for it. So it seems logical to me that we can start with this idea that Brahman wants to know itself, and that this oneness of Brahman, when it manifests, it will manifest in pairs of opposites. If you start with oneness, you have to manifest in pairs of opposites. It's like a string. When you pluck a string, it vibrates up and down. And I like that analogy. The instrument is like Brahman that never changes, and the music that comes out of it is like the manifestation, and it comes out as pairs of opposites. We also have the very frequent image in our mythologies of a cosmic egg, Hiranyagarbha in the Hindu tradition, where this oneness splits into two. Now, the apparitional causation of Shankara is not a happening in time, but as we speak in terms of things in space and time, and so our language, again, is necessarily somewhat flawed, but you'll just have to put up with it. Otherwise, I won't be able to say anything. So, the first pair of opposites is this subject-object duality. The process, if you want to know yourself, you have to have a subject and an object. Otherwise, there's no process of knowing. But it's interesting to note that there needs to be only one subject. The object, you might have only one, or you might have many. Now, from the standpoint of this oneness, then comes this subject-object split. Now, that's your first couple of things on your handout. Just a little diagram there. And when you have it, whether you call it subject-object or perceiver and perceived, that then implies this third thing, the relationship between the two, the object, the act of perception. And note that they depend on each other. You can't have a notion of a subject without having a notion of an object. And as soon as you have a notion of a subject and an object, you have a notion of perception. It all comes out together. Now, this forms what we call a tangled hierarchy. If you try later on down the road to figure out how the object comes out of the subject or how the subject comes out of the object, you're doomed to fail because neither one came out of the other. They both arose out of the original apparition all together. So that's a very important thing to note in this model, and this is why the monistic materialists, when they try to get consciousness out of matter, are going to run into all sorts of problems. Now, it is said that Brahman is beyond space and time, and it manifests through the power of Maya, or the veil of Maya, which is made up of space, time, and causation. That's number 3 on your little chart. So we should ask, are space and time a pair of opposites? If we're proposing that this universe is created out of pairs of opposites, are space and time a pair of opposites? And it turns out, in an interesting way, they are. When Einstein formulated his theory of relativity, he was disturbed that this world was not as objective and deterministic as he thought, and that the measurements of distance and the measurements of time depended on the observer. And so he said, well, there must be some combination of space-time that everybody will agree on. So he came up with this formula, which is down there on number 3, I believe, which said that if you take the combination of space and time, where you take the space separation and square it and the time separation and square it, subtract the two and take the square root of that, that number is objective for all observers. It doesn't matter who's doing it, whether they're running by at 90% of the speed of light, whether they're going up or down, backwards or forwards. Everybody agrees on that number. But the interesting consequence of that number is that anything that we see away from us in space and backward in time comes up with a 0 separation. There is no objective separation between you and everything you experience in your visible universe. Talk about oneness. Doesn't get any better than that. So just as we have the concept of perception arising from the perceiver-perceived split, causation arises from the time-space split. Again, you can't really envision causation until you have a platform in which it's going to operate, and that platform is space and time. And light appears to be the conversion factor, you could say, between space and time. It is the way energy apparently goes from one place to another. You see, we see things separated in space and separated in time. But in the objective reality that Einstein discovered, they have no separation, and nothing has to go anywhere. So light, in that sense, in the four-dimensional reality of Einstein, light isn't going anywhere. It's not traveling at any speed. So the speed of light is simply our perception in this world of Maya, where we see things away from us in space and backward in time. Now, note how cleverly the Divine Mother puts these pairs of opposites together. They are not completely opposite. They are opposite in some sense, but they are not opposite in some other sense. So we have 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. You see, if we had a universe of antimatter and matter, it would just fall apart. That's no fun. So you have to do this in a very clever way. So we've begun our cosmology by seeing that oneness apparently becomes 2, the subject and the object, in order to know itself. And the framework of this operation of the subject and object is space and time. So these pairs arise apparitionally, simultaneously, and create the concept of perception and causation. And so perception, which is fundamental to this idea of our consciousness, is inherent in the nature of the way the apparition arises. So let us further examine this idea of an apparitional universe. Using Shankara's idea that we have mistaken Brahman for something else, we must ask, what is that else? If Brahman is the infinite, undivided, unchanging reality, what mistake can you make about it? The only mistake you can make about the infinite is to see it as finite. The only mistake you can make about the undivided is to see it as divided, and the only mistake you can make about the unchanging is that it's changing. So we end up with a universe that's finite, divided, and changing, and that's exactly the way we see it here. Now, dividedness and change are fairly obvious. If you don't see that everything's all divided up here and that we keep changing all the time, I can't help you. But the finite nature of the universe might be a little more difficult. So let's examine that. Our observable universe, notice I use that term often, observable universe, has a border to it, dictated by the apparent expansion of the universe. Since everything appears to be going away from us in space because of the redshift, everything, and the further away we look, they seem to be going faster and faster. Eventually, things are so far away that they're going so fast away that they're approaching the speed of light. Now, this creates a redshift in everything we see at a distance from us. And someone mentioned it's now put at about 13.7 billion light years away. So way out there at about 13.7 billion light years away, everything is going away from us so fast that the light doesn't have a chance to reach us anymore. So this puts a boundary on our observable universe. The light from the objects is redshifted away, and the red shifting tells us that the energy of those objects, our information about those objects, now says those objects have less energy. Their energy is represented by their wavelength, and red wavelengths or red-shifted wavelengths are lower and lower energy. So as they approach the speed of light going away from us, their energy is redshifted towards zero. Now, if their energy and momentum are redshifted towards zero, we can't make a very big mistake about nothing, right? If you're trying to measure something, if you're measuring yourself, you could be off by an ounce or two. That's no problem. But you can't measure an atom and be off by an ounce or two. And so as the mass of the object going away from us approaches zero, our uncertainty about its mass also goes to zero. Now, Heisenberg has a problem with that. He says if your uncertainty in that quantity goes to zero, you must be completely uncertain about where it is. The uncertainty of where it is has to go to infinity. So if the uncertainty about where it is goes to infinity, it could be anywhere. Now, note that you never see a particle cross the border of the universe. Don't bother to get out of border control to find out. You never see anything crossing the universe, crossing the border of the universe. Things just get redshifted so badly that they simply, you can't keep track of them, and suddenly they reappear somewhere else. So here we have a recycling model where you get fresh hydrogen recycling into the universe. So the borders of the universe are now populated by this field of low rest mass particles with their energy being redshifted away because of our seeing them going away. And this explains the 3D background radiation. When radiation comes through a field of low rest mass particles, those particles will pick up the radiation and then re-radiate it. And another one will pick it up and it'll be re-radiated. And it will be picked up and re-radiated so often that it will be thermalized to 3 degrees K. Now, Dr. Sharma pointed out yesterday that a closed system is doomed to die from an increase in entropy. Entropy is a scientific term that measures how much energy is in a scrambled or unusable form. And it is seen to be increasing in the universe. And most of our Big Bang model and cosmological models have the universe dying in what's called the heat death of the universe. But this apparitional model gives us a steady-state universe in which, although everything locally appears to be going downhill as far as entropy is concerned, overall, nothing is ever changing. Just like the Shanti mantra says, Purnamada Purnamidam. Everything appears to be changing. Everything comes out of Brahman, everything we see, everything we don't see. But nothing, Brahman never changes. So this overall universe isn't changing at all. And you get this fresh supply of hydrogen, which can fall together by gravity, and that's the nicest form of negative entropy you can ask for. Now, Shankara points out that there are, Maya has three powers. The veiling power, and this is number 5 on your sheet, the veiling power of tamas, the projecting power of rajas, and the revealing power of sattva. Now, these are not the way Sankhyans use these terms. Shankara uses them a little differently, and that's okay. The Upanishads doesn't make very much mention of them, so philosophers are free to do what they want. So this is the way Shankara sees them. He sees them as three qualities of a mistake. So we fail to see the infinite, undivided, unchanging Brahman as it is. That's the veiling power of tamas. We project a universe that is finite, divided, and changing. That's rajas. Now we should ask, where's the sattva in all this? Does the reality of Brahman show through in the nature of this universe, into our physics? How does the infinite, undivided, and unchanging show through? Well, the infinite will show through as the electrical charge, the undividedness is revealed as gravity, and the unchanging is revealed as inertia. Now, the first two require some explanation. Why does the negative electrical charge represent the infinite nature of the reality showing through? Like charges hate each other, and they want to be as far apart from each other as possible. It's a repulsive force that wants to be as far apart as possible. That's the infinitude showing through. Gravity wants everything to fall together, and so that's the oneness or the undividedness showing through. And inertia is the changeless showing through. Things have a tendency just to keep doing what they're doing and not change. Now, electrons and protons are an interesting pair of opposites. We notice that this universe is formed in pairs of opposites, but they're not necessarily identical. Great example here. Electrons and protons are opposite in charge, but they are not opposite in mass. So let's examine that. What determines the mass of an electron? Again, it's this infinitude showing through. If using calculus, you calculate how much energy it would take to squeeze one negative charge against itself down to the size we see an electron to be, what you get, and this is number 7, that amount of energy that it takes to squeeze a negative charge down to the size that we perceive an electron to be is the E in the formula mc squared. The mass we calculate for an electron times c squared, that's the energy it takes to take one charge and squeeze it against itself. There is nothing else in the electron except us stupidly seeing infinity as small, and it only depends on itself. It doesn't depend on anything else. The proton, however, is very different. It has a mass that's more than 18 times as heavy as the electron, so it can't be due just to its being seen small in the electrical field. The mass of the proton depends on its separation from all the other mass in the observable universe. If you took away half the matter in the universe, the mass of the protons would all go down. Their mass depends on there being another universe out there. They don't just depend on themselves. So they are a plurality problem. The electron is a singular problem. And I think that's because the electron is symbolic microcosmically of the subject, the singular subject. There is only one subject. But the proton is symbolic of the objective world, which can be plural. We have a plurality in the objective world. Now, did the ancients intuit that E equals mc squared, that an object's mass is its energy? Well, consider the 5 elements of antiquity: Akasha, Vayu, Tejas, Ap, and Prithivi. Each of those in our scriptures is associated with a sense organ. Why? Our sense organs detect energy. That's a clue. So let's look at it. Akasha is associated with the ear. Now, you might think sound, but it's actually gravity. Gravity is a more fundamental energy. Vayu, wind, not air, wind, is associated with the sense of touch, and that's kinetic energy, associated with temperature. Tejas is something that shines. It's not just fire, it's something that shines. And that's something that your eye picks up. That's radiation, electromagnetic radiation. Ap, water, is associated with the tongue. Your tongue senses sour things, and sour things are nothing but a proton with a positive charge, electricity. And your nose senses smells that are determined by magnetic bonds. So our 5 elements are energies. And these 5 energies make up the physical universe because E equals mc squared. The mass of something is its energy. It's not that you convert one to the other. They are the same, and that's what the equation says. Now, it's interesting to note, again, that we have conservation laws, number 9 on your sheet. We have the conservation of charge, the conservation of momentum, the conservation of angular momentum, and the conservation of mass energy. The charge of the universe goes to 0. It's a pair of opposites. The momentum goes to 0. Everything cancels out. It's an apparition of oneness, appearing as many. The angular momentum goes to 0. The mass and energy, it does not go to 0. What does it represent? It represents the existence. It is saying, I exist. I am manifest. I am that. That represents the energy of Brahman. It is this energy of Brahman that is manifesting as this universe. It's masquerading in this universe. Looking at it as a whole, we see that we have a universe that wants to be infinite. It's expanding. It appears everything that is getting bigger and bigger. It wants to all fall together by gravity. But because the entropy is recycled, nothing ever changes. And the whole thing is alive. The whole universe is alive. Every particle knows about every other particle. Every proton depends on every other proton for its mass. And every electron knows about every proton because it's opposite in charge. So there is this innate intelligence in the universe that pervades everything we see. And that's the fundamental idea that we need to approach our science of consciousness. Thank you very much.
And so if you want to ask a question, could you please come up to the microphone at the front and, introduce yourself so we can all hear the question as well.
An excellent discussion of Vedanta and science. But I want to problematize a little bit the place where you started and where you spoke of the creation as springing out of a desire of Brahman to know itself. I'm problematizing it because if we propose that creation begins out of the desire of the infinite to know itself, then we end up saying that before that, the infinite did not know itself. In other words, we're proposing ignorance before creation. And in the Upanishads, I think, more broadly speaking, the impulse for creation is not the desire to know, but the desire to multiply. May I become many. Rather than desire to know itself. Bahusyam prajayayeti, and so on. And in Brahma Sutra, the expression there is Leela Kaivalyavat, for the sake of Leela. So I was just wondering, perhaps you mean something different when you say that to know itself, which would not presuppose a condition of ignorance before that action took place. But somehow it seems that desire, if you leave it at the desire of the one to know itself, that has to be nuanced in some ways. It has to be clarified because then one proposes that the infinite did not know itself before creation.
Another prominent theme in mythologies and scriptures is this idea of just wanting to be many, being lonely is the other way. But no matter how you put it, there's some sort of desire or lack in Brahman, and none of those things are really very satisfactory because we can't really conceive that Brahman really has any lack. So why does it bother to manifest at all? But we have to have some framework in order to begin a model. And so looking at the preponderance of mythologies and cosmologies, something of that nature would be a reasonable place to start. But you're right, as I said earlier, no model is perfect. As soon as you open your mouth, you've defiled the nature of Brahman. It's because it's unspeakable. And so you just sort of pick your poison and go from there.
The text is very precisely saying that it is not the Brahman itself that tadakshata bahusyam pradayaya, but rather it is the aham nama. When there is this I sense, only in that I sense arises this incompleteness that, man, I'm alone, I need a wife. So then the creation comes into being. Thank you.
In terms of what we were just saying about this problem of desire, could another possible way to look at this be that if one thinks in terms of the essential characteristics of Brahman as infinite being, consciousness, bliss, that from our perspective, our Maya-ridden perspective, that we cannot conceive of consciousness without the one who is conscious and that of which it is conscious, or bliss without an enjoyer and an enjoyed. So this whole bifurcation there's a sort of logical necessity to it, and that eliminates or mitigates maybe this question of desire.
You're conscious of the Godhead, and there's just you and God, but then once you get past that, you can't, his tongue is tied and he can't say anything. So that's the dilemma, is how to get from that stage to the stage where we can start talking about it. Right?
There's a lineage from Swami Vivekananda to William James to Whitehead, because I'm very engaged with process thought myself. Quick question, though. From some of the things I've read, it seems to me that while William James was very impressed with Swami Vivekananda, there were areas where they differed substantially also. And I'm wondering, in terms of like studying texts of William James, if you really looked into the extent to which there really was an influence or not in that regard.
If we examine the varieties of religious experience, he really uses that as his definition of religious experience. So consequently, from that, I think there really is not only agreement, but the gauntlet is laid down that everything must be proof-tested against this definition, which he then expands upon in his discussion of Buck's analysis of the ecstatic states experienced by Walt Whitman. And this language of cosmic consciousness arises out of Buck's discussion of Walt Whitman. And for those of us who read Walt Whitman, and I actually lived, our ashram is in Amityville, which is where Walt Whitman lived for some time. One of the first courses I ever taught was on the poetry of Walt Whitman. And in that exuberance, I think we find a little bit more than just a romanticization, because it's coming out of someone's body-felt experience of connectivity with this place called Long Island, specifically.
The question has to do with, Veda's God of Brahman is called Akamo Dhiro, Amriten Swayambhu. So if he's Akamo, which means he's got no desire, then why does he divide? I think that's the question. And then the second question comes in, if he divides, I'm a medical physician. One person, you can use it as one person born in a very wealthy home, other one is born very poor, one person is born healthy, and then we have children who are so far deformed really that they don't even have almost a brain. We call them anencephalic. That's not a very justful God or justful Brahman then, that he gives birth to one hand, who's super healthy, everything, who's going to be a Swami in future, versus he gives birth to a child who is going to be never anything, become anything. So what do you think of that?
We'll just have to accept it, whether we have an explanation for why Brahman does it or not. You can simply accept that it's manifesting this way. And then as far as things like good and evil, we usually explain that it's pairs of opposites. If everything's in pairs of opposites, you don't know what poor is unless you see rich. You don't know what healthy is unless you've been sick. How many people know people that have never been sick and then they suddenly get sick? Oh, now I understand what other people go through. They didn't understand it until they actually got sick themselves. So these pairs of opposites are simply the nature of it. It's neither good nor bad. It's simply the nature of the manifestation. And there really isn't any other explanation for why. You see, it's really one. It's not that somebody has been singled out. It's not that there are many of us here. There's only one of us here. It just appears that we're many of us. And so the sum total is...
If we change the translation of the first word of Genesis, Bereshit, to the more correct from the point or from the singularity, do we not change the whole argument regarding evolution and religion?
There's that beautiful flow from chaos and then there was water, but there wasn't water. Then there was fire, but there wasn't fire. Tension between the Asat and the Sat, and the mystery of emergence goes to, again, I forget, it may be a Whitehead word, but the mystery really of allurement. What is it that attracts us outward?